Doubt as a sign of faith. Dr. Craig, that's an article in the New York Times. You remember a couple of years ago, and by the way, this was written by Julia Baird, who's an author, a journalist, television presenter with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. She's working on a biography of Queen Victoria and has written this for the New York Times. A while back, you remember the Most Reverend Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, said that recently, at times, he questioned if God was really there. Much of the reaction was predictably juvenile, quoting now from Julia. Even God's earthly emissary isn't sure if the whole thing is made up. And you remember when the Archbishop said this, and there was all this social media on it, and the atheist said, "Finally!" And there was controversy that was sparked in all this. So immediately this brings up the issue of doubt and faith. And here it is in the New York Times. So it's an opportunity for us to look at the two, especially from the standpoint of your work. Bill, what do you think about the title, Doubt as a Sign of Faith?
I suppose that you can't doubt something unless you believe it. In that sense, it would say that you have a lack of certainty, but it wouldn't be incompatible with believing it. So I think she's quite right in saying that doubt and belief can coexist together.
And this has been called the doubt of the century by International Business Times, but it's actually pretty tame, she points out. She says, his remarks were just that the other day I was praying over something as I was running, and I ended up saying to God, "Look, this is all very well, but isn't it about time you did something if you're there?" Okay, he was kind of wrestling with God here a little bit in his own private prayer life.
Right.
And everyone took this as some kind of big crisis of faith. It doesn't look like it really was.
No, I think she's quite right in saying that, as she puts it, certainty is often overrated. And she gives the example of the disciples, even Jesus' cry from the cross, "Why have you forsaken me?" where he feels abandoned by God, though at the same time exhibiting faith because he's praying the words of Psalm 22 there, which is expressing his faith in God. So she says, and I like this, as courage is persisting in the face of fear, faith is persisting in the presence of doubt. Faith becomes then a commitment, a practice, and a pact that is usually sustained by belief. So faith, I think she properly sees, is a form of trust or commitment in something that you believe to be true. And that isn't incompatible with a lack of 100% certainty.
Sure. And Bill, this is in the Bible. It's in the Psalms where the psalmist says, "God, how long will you hide from me? How long will you hide your face from me, Lord? Lord, how long will you be angry?" And so on. And so it's a very human wrestling with God, very human dimension that we see there. And we've discussed on this podcast, there's nothing wrong with that wrestling. What would be, though, the proper way to do it, do you think, without becoming, blasphemous, for example?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to go to God with your doubts and to be honest with him. As you say, the psalmist expressed these openly rather than trying to stuff it and hide it. And I think also it's very important for people to be able to find others that they can talk to about these. Many people who leave the church say that the reason they left was because they didn't feel that they could be honest and open about the doubts that they had and the struggles they had. And so they were just stuffing them down inside until they became self-destructive. So a person needs to get into some sort of a group or circle where these things can be discussed honestly. I think Gary Habermas's work on doubt, too, is also very helpful, where he emphasizes that doubt is primarily emotional rather than intellectual. And that's why, as he says, doubt is usually worse at night, which is very odd. It's not just a sort of intellectual matter. It's really primarily emotional. And so
you need to go to bed.
Yeah, right.
It could be a sign you need to get some
then
sleep.
one needs to deal with it on that sort of emotional level. And that will mean things like being involved in meaningful corporate worship, where your emotions will be engaged in worshiping and praising God, in other spiritual disciplines like prayer, fellowship, sharing one's faith. These are all ways in which one can deal with these emotional problems that occasion doubt. Now, of course, if there are intellectual questions, then those need to be faced honestly and
I'm certainly
explored.
not saying sleep it off, ignore them, and go to bed.
No.
I'm just saying if it sometimes it's a result of hunger, loneliness, being tired, and the remedy is, perhaps at that point maybe to get some rest. So that's all I'm saying. And now you're continuing.
Well, and you're right about that, Kevin. If Gary is right, and I think he is, that the doubts we experience are primarily emotional, then they need to be dealt with on that level. But insofar as we do have unanswered questions of an intellectual nature, I think one of the most exhilarating experiences in the Christian life can be to take one of these questions and to pursue it into the ground until we come to intellectual peace with that issue. Just to give an illustration, I struggled for years to understand the relationship between God and time. On the one hand, I believed that God was timeless and had created time and space. But on the other hand, as a Christian, I believed that Jesus was God incarnate, that he lived in history and therefore was in time. And this seemed like a contradiction. How could the timeless enter into time? Well, as a result of my work on time and eternity and God's relationship to time, I came to an intellectually satisfactory model of the relationship between God and time that gave me complete intellectual peace about this issue. And that is tremendously satisfying. It enables your restless mind to come to peace with this issue, to have confidence in God, and to put to bed one of those questions that has been troubling you. And so I would encourage our listeners, insofar as they have an area where there's a doubt, don't just allow that to fester. Go after it and begin to read the work of good Christian philosophers, theologians, and biblical exegetes on this. And by the way, Kevin, I suppose here a piece of practical advice. I am shocked at the folly of many Christians who are struggling with doubt. And so what they do is they go to the internet and they begin to watch videos by people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and the internet infidels, and then they wonder why they're struggling with their faith. That is not the resource you turn to in order to get good answers to your questions. You need to go to the work of the finest Christian philosophers, theologians, biblical critics on these questions and see what they have to say and whether this stands up to the critiques and the doubts that are occasioned by the critics of Christianity.
Would someone accuse you then of being kind of selective in what you're going to see?
They would, yes, but I'll stick by what I've said. I read the work of those other people, and the immature Christian who isn't intellectually sophisticated ought not to be reading that sort of stuff until he has thoroughly grounded himself in the work of good Christian thinkers.
Yeah, why not see what your fellow Christians say first?
Right.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with that.
No, and if it turns out that they're wrong, well, then you can deal with that. But first, you need to get grounded before you jump into the deep end. We've talked about this before. You need to learn to swim first before you are thrown into the deep end. That only makes good sense.
This article continues. It does this, presents this famous Mother Teresa quote.
Yeah.
Where she startled the world, according to the article, when her posthumous diaries revealed that she was tormented by a continual gloom and aching to see or sense God. In 1953, she wrote, "Please pray especially for me that I may not spoil His work, and that our Lord may show Himself, for there is such terrible darkness within me, as if everything was dead. It's been like this more or less from the time I started the work." Well, Bill, she sounds depressed to me. I mean, it could be.
Well, that could be. I mean, somebody living in the conditions that she did in India and ministering to the refuse of Indian society, the untouchables and the poor and the maimed and disabled, you could imagine the horrible stresses and gloom that would result from that sort of
She didn't have
experience.
a beach ministry in Hawaii.
No. I mean, gosh.
I think this is such a balanced quote from her. She didn't want to spoil His work.
Yeah. Her desire was for prayer. Asking for prayer so that God's work wouldn't be spoiled.
And let me grow in Him. Let me see Him more and more.
Yeah.
You know, but man, you know, it is profound. Well, her local pastor, Julia's, the author's local pastor, Tim Giovanelli, he's a Baptist who's ocean swimming. Tim Giovanelli, he says this, quote, "For Welby, myself, and many others, it's not that we have certainty, but have seen the plausibility of faith and positive impact it can make. In a broken world, that can be enough." What do you think about that?
I think that's a great quotation. Notice the balance that he has. He says, we may not have certainty, that's not the important thing, but we have seen the plausibility of faith. He's saying that this makes good sense. The Christian worldview makes sense of the facts of experience. It's a reasonable faith. Mm-hmm. That's what he's saying. Yeah. We've seen the plausibility of faith. And then secondly, the positive impact it can make. It changes lives. And this would, I think, speak to the affective results of Christian faith. It produces wholeness and happiness and joy and meaning and purpose for living, all of those deep existential things that we long for. It meets the needs of our heart as well as the needs of our head. And so I think Pastor Giovanelli is spot on there, that it's not certainty that's the important thing, but you see that you have a reasonable faith that positively changes lives.